Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our very first Teaching and Learning for Student Success webinar of 2017. Our presenter for today is Dr. Gabrielle Tayac. Dr. Tayac is a member of the Piscataway Indian Nation. She is an activist scholar committed to empowering Indigenous perspectives. Gabrielle earned her PhD and master's in sociology from Harvard University and her bachelor's in social work and American Indian Studies from Cornell University. Her scholarly research focuses on American Indian identity, multiracialism, indigenous religions, and social movements, maintaining a regional specialization in the Chesapeake Bay. Gabrielle has served in staff and advisory capacities for numerous organizations, including Amnesty International, Survival International, National Geographic, the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, the Historic St. Mary's Commission, the Accokeek Foundation, the National Park Service, and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Center for the Humanities. In her passionate youth, she co-founded the League of Indigenous Sovereign Nations, a hemispheric alliance of Native people, which led the largest action north of Mexico to mark 500 years of American Indian survival in 1992. Gabrielle is regularly featured in the media, including National Public Radio, Tavis Smiley, the BBC, the Washington Post, and the Christian Science Monitor. She lectures widely to diverse audiences at venues ranging from the White House to kindergarten classrooms. Currently, Gabrielle is a historian at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. At NMAI, she had also served as the unit head for education and a curator. She co-curated one of NMAI's inaugural exhibitions with Jolene Ricard and Gerald McMaster called Our Lives, Contemporary Life and Identity. She is also the curator of Return to a Native Place, Native Peoples of the Chesapeake Region, which opened in 2007. Gabrielle co-curated the banner traveling exhibit Indivisible, African Native American Lives in the Americas, and served as general editor for the book of the same name. She lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland, with her 3 children, Sebastian, Jonsique, and Antonio. And I am going to now turn it over to Gabrielle.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be with you this afternoon. And it's a very interesting time in Washington, D.C. Most of us are working at home today because where our museum is, I'm at National Museum of the American Indian, we're right next to the Capitol, and it's quite barricaded downtown, so we were mostly advised quite happily, in my view, of being able to share, do our work at home today. So that's where I'm speaking to you from, and this is my first webinar, so I can add that to the list, which is really exciting. I would like to talk to you today about my own experiences first, and because you're doing, as you all know, and just to remind you, the work in terms of preparing our next generation, certainly from our perspective, from my tribal perspective, everything we do, we move into thinking about what is in the 7th generation, not just impacting ourselves or our children or our grandchildren, but what the 7th generation is, and then also recalling that we're here because 7 generations ago somebody thought about us. So I'm probably different in many ways from some of your presenters, or many of them, in the sense that I don't work full-time per se in education. And I don't always work with students to the degree that you do. But I think it's so key in terms of forming ways for us to think about how to look at different modalities, different pedagogies, different ways that we can reach across boundaries and move ourselves forward. I know that many of you work with Latino, Latina students, and also because we know that there are so many indigenous students that are within that population, and that you're working as well with Native students. And those boundaries, in my view, certainly are are not necessarily fixed. They're quite fluid, and there's a lot of movement between them. So to think about different kinds of ways of accessing knowledge and exciting people about looking at the direct sources that come from within culture and how that can invigorate and inspire your students, and how that can start to have them form knowledge in a way that might be different, and the kinds of impacts it can take, not just in the classroom and not just through the written form, but through the physical form. So what I would like to present to you is this concept that I've been working with quite a bit, where today I was thinking about it in terms of ancestors and living voices in museums and education. What you see before you on screen is in our collection. The National Museum of the American Indian has almost 1 million objects that range from about 10,000 years BC to the present, to the contemporary. We deal with North, Central, and South America and Native Hawaii. And what you see here is a really extraordinary Mishtek shield that's made of turquoise inlay that's in our collection. So it's just one of the, happens to be one of the most exceptional pieces in the collection at NMAI, which is stored in a place called the Cultural Resources Center. And to think about how it's an object, it's a numbered piece, it sits in a repository, it's in a building that has fluorescent lighting, it's held with gloves, people who have gloves on to protect it, it's scanned and barcoded, it's written about, it's considered, but it also has a voice. And it was part of a person's world, and it was part of a person's dreams, it was part of a society, and it's what we have as part of the most direct kind of contact that we can have with ancestors. So there's many ways of interpreting that. And to think about an object like this, and to consider it, and how much it can open the world, especially for students, I think, who maybe are looking at wondering about abstraction, just to open up the possibility of working with objects and visuals and experience and the sensory. So that's something that museums can offer. So I wanted to go to the next slide. Thank you. I wanted to give you all a little, I have like a little Indians 101 that we put together, because something that is absolutely the case in Native American topics, and I know this is true for so many other people not in the mainstream, is that our K through 12 preparation is really it's really lacking. And it's not just lacking, actually, in a lot of ways. We have to think about when we're talking about Native studies, is that there's a lot of unlearning that has to be done when people enter the museum, or they're dealing with topics, or they're meeting Native peoples, Native American people, Indigenous people. It's not just starting from scratch. You're not starting from a blank slate. You're starting from what makes the red men red, and you're starting from Land O'Lakes butter, and you're starting from every stereotype, good, bad, or ugly that you can think of. So a lot of what we need to do is a bit of unlearning, but this is it in a nutshell. In the United States, there are about 563 nations that are federally recognized by the United States, which means that they have a nation-to-nation relationship. In addition, there's about another 200 that have relationships with their states. So with Native American people, American Indians, First Nations, there's so many different ways that people call themselves or refer to themselves. But it's not just an ethnicity. It's not, people don't consider themselves necessarily a minority, or not in addition to other things, but it's also a citizenship status. So there's 3 levels of government in the United States. There's federal, state, and tribal. And so that's what we call sovereignty. Of those, about 500, well, there's a little bit more now since I first did this. A couple more have been recognized which is a very complicated process. Of those people in those nations, there's about, who's an American Indian. There's about 1.5 million people in the US who receive services from because of their status in federally recognized tribes. But there are about 4 million people total that identified on the US Census, on the last census. So that's self-identification. And what all of the complications that are involved with that are many. But that gives you a basic range, but considering the population overall, it's still a very small sector of the US. Also, there's about 1 million people on the last census who identified as indigenous people from Latin America. So that's another really massive group of people, as I said, that we're seeing this possibility and the reality of who we're talking about when we're talking about indigenous people. And across the Americas, North, Central, South, there are about 4 million indigenous peoples that are identified. And again, those definitions are fuzzy and they change from place to place. Each of these peoples, each of these societies has their own original language, government, religious traditions, and many of them, the people that you see now, have really persisted through the 500 years, 500 plus years. So it's quite extraordinary, actually. We ended up with about, it was about the population range is about 5 to 12 million, with what would be within the current boundaries of what's called the United States now in 1492, estimated, and then it plummeted to about 250,000 people in 1900. So we are in an incredible recovery period. So if we can go to the next one. To the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so this is the National Museum of the American Indian. And I came from originally a human rights background, and sociology is what my doctorate is in. And I thought that I was going to become a political sociologist. And I was finishing up, and so this is to kind of think of, this is something that I talk to students about a lot, is that I was finishing up my doctorate, and I got a call from an undergraduate professor of mine, and she said, I heard you're finishing, and she said, I'm working on this project. I'm working in, do you know anything about the National Museum of the American Indian? And I was like, yeah, because this was in 1999. And she said, well, I've been, I'm glad you stayed in touch with me. So I thought that maybe you should come here and work for us. And what do you think? And I said, what, you should never say in a job interview, which is like, well, I don't know. and I don't know, and I don't really know anything about museums, and I don't, are you sure? And she said, yes, come in. And she started to talk to me about what they were conceiving of at NMAI. This was before it was built. The legislation had passed to create it in 1989. And I thought that when I started to hear more from her, because I started to think that maybe that was something that I could do. Museums and Native peoples have had a contentious and complicated relationship over time, because the expertise of who's the expert and who's not really was defined in a very strict way. And of course, Native peoples, being people who were not invested with having their authority, because there was the racism, the ideas of who's civilized and who is not, who is an expert and who is not, who can speak and who is not. And even still to this day, we have issues of, sometimes I'll be invited to a panel or an event, and they'll say, well, we have the academic perspective and we need the Native perspective, so why don't you come? And I'm thinking, I've got a PhD from Harvard. Like, where do you want in terms of academics? But sometimes I get invited as the Native American on the panel, and so that's something where we have to start to change these paradigms, and that's been work that's been done for so long. It's been done now for a number of decades. People like Maria Marta Chavez, who's your who's a dean at Yale, who's with Catch the Next, people who have been on the forefront. Maybe some of you that I'm talking to have been so much more on the front lines than I have. But this was a possibility, NMAI, to start to change where we would invest knowledge, where we would prioritize who has the right to say what is and what isn't. And we were deciding to put that voice and that authority into the hands, back into the hands where it really belongs, which is in the communities with people who have traditional knowledge in combination with academic disciplinary training. So what we're starting to see in the past probably 20 years, more and more, are people who can cross those lines. And that's where I think it becomes very exciting and it becomes very relevant that as we're able to move from an outside external perspective or to partner with it, and then to say what you've learned from your families, from your communities, should be validated, should be understood, should be at least on a parity and sometimes prioritized from what we might be reading elsewhere, or at least cross-checked. And that's the way I started my academic background as well. I started from the idea that I had heard so much wisdom, so many stories, so many concepts of incredible intellectual capacity in people who did not necessarily have academic degrees. And I was encountering more and more, particularly in the field of Native studies, or there wasn't really that much of a field of Native studies, but of people that were doing work on Native peoples, that was still being very much undercut. It was not being considered that Native people had the authority to speak of their own experience or to be validated. If somebody had written in a book, then because it was written down, that was always considered to be more important. So listening to these stories and wanting to understand what had happened to my community, which is Piscataway, which is a small Atlantic seaboard community, tribal community, I thought that it would be very important to pursue an academic track that would then make it real, make it acceptable, and insist on that methodology. And I was very, very fortunate that as an undergraduate, because there was a few years prior to me, there had been a move to, in this early phase of ethnic studies, of instituting something called the American Indian Studies program at Cornell University. And they had the concept of something called the full circle, where they would bring us in, we would go through the academics, and then go back and give something back to our communities in some way. It didn't always necessarily mean going back to the tribal community, but working with Native people and reversing the brain drain. So that was through the 80s, and that's something that has followed me my entire life. Charlotte Heth, who was the person who hired me at NMAI, was my professor at Cornell as part of that program. And the person that ended up being my supervisor for the past 10 years, Jose Barrero, who works with a lot of indigenous Latin American work, was also one of my mentors at Cornell. And so we've also created this network, which is very, very interesting. And that's all been invested now in a place like NMAI, where we are privileging Native voice and Native stories.
So thinking about education in a museum, in objects, with things, in spaces where we don't have classes or bound sets of students, but everybody is our student. We have to relate from babies to toddlers, to tenured professors, to lawmakers, to people who just want to find the bathroom. Try to sometimes it's like really kind of sobering when you work for years on an exhibition and you find out that most of the people who come in your building, they go to the shop, they go to the restaurant, they go to the bathroom, they like whiz through in about like 10 minutes. But at the same time, there are many, many people who take things very seriously. So we have about 1.5 million visitors a year. And there was a study done by the American Association of Museums that talked about how the public trusts museums as a source of reliable information more than any other source. Like if you see something in a museum, it must be real. If you want to see the real thing, you go to a museum. If somebody writes it, then maybe it's questioned. If it's in the media, maybe, especially now, right? Fake news, it's questioned. There's all sorts of questionings about other kinds of sources because it's very clear to people that when you read something, see something on TV, see something in film, although film is very powerful, all of these are powerful sources, powerful presentations, but when you say, I want to show you something real, you take somebody to a museum, and that's real. The person behind the curtain, however, it's also written, it's also decided, it's also constructed. And that's something that we don't tend to think about. Who chooses what's there? Who chooses how to show it? Even how to arrange it. So it's a very heavy sense of what is true and what is truth, and the controlling of truth and the presentation of what is truth. But it's also constructive. So it's also a social experience. Like when you write something, you have to read in order. Right? Like you read a sentence, you read the words in order and you follow it on the page. When you see a film, it's in a sequence. But in a museum, it's social. Maybe you're there as a person. Nobody's making you go into a certain way or think of a certain space at all. It's a very different way of learning, and it's one we call a constructivist approach. So that when you go into space, this is a small gallery of the Lakota cosmology that's in our Universes exhibition that was co-curated with traditional knowledge bearers and keepers. And there's not really necessarily emerged. Sometimes people tend to think like, oh, are you an academic or are you an Indian? And sometimes like even with I was like, you can go and get your PhD from Harvard, and I still get invited to panels, and they say, oh, could you, we have academics already, could you be the Indian on the panel? And I'm like, I could be both. Like, what do I have to, it's like, what do I have to do, So, but the idea that also with the kinds of studies and the kinds of working and thinking and work that you're all doing, those boundaries, those borders, they're emerging much more, what's in the academy and what's outside of the academy. But this is a case where people chose the concepts to give the most fundamental ideas, bringing things from the collection into this space, creating even the space of an environment that would represent the Lakota world of 4 sacred directions, sacred tree in the middle, the stages of life bounded by directions and values. The community, the knowledge bearers chose objects to represent it. They were not concerned at all about the age of it, by showing, do you show something that was created 200 years ago or something that was just made in a contemporary time? It was the idea, and putting those things together in a way that made sense to them. So when you have a visitor, or in our case, you can think about them as a student, they walk into the space, you can go over to look at the Warriors shirt, you could go look at the children's games, you could just stand in the middle and think about it. So you can select where you go, and you create your own sense of meaning out of these pieces. We can put those pieces for you, but then everybody tends to reflect on it in themselves. And what we also find, there's always a challenge when you're dealing directly with this kind of ancestral and contemporary interaction of voice. If somebody's coming in with a stereotype or a misconception, they'll overlay that right on top of it. So we always have that kind of concern about how do you pin that back. So thinking about collections as sources, I didn't realize this when I got hired. Like I said, I had no museum experience whatsoever, so I didn't realize that an exhibit was like what I now call authoring something in 3 dimensions. It's actually writing with space. That's the way I think about it. I think about it as writing with space. You can select, you have an idea, you select either on your own or in conversation with others what you need to tell a story. And even though we use words in labels to explain something, the fact is, I mean, I don't know about you, but like I even now don't always read all the labels of everything. I mean, you go into a museum, you kind of like look around, you may be, if you're really into it, you'll read a label. Some people read all the labels, but you have to make sense of it just by what's seen and the way things look. And you can't crutch, it's never a book on a wall. So this is actually, this is Caroline Parker, who's a Seneca knowledge bearer from the late 19th, early 20th century. And she created this really beautiful, this is her wearing this traditional Seneca. They're from New York State and going up into Canada, the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And then we have, there's the skirt in reality that's been preserved with, I'll talk about this more later, but this motif of the cosmos and the sprouting tree and what she brings with it. So it's something that she made, that she designed, that was worn and known and understood at a certain time, and then it carries through time. So if you go and you look at it, you have a conversation with it. What does it tell you? How do you find out more? Do you just look at the object? Do you go talk to people in the cultural community? Do you dance with it? Are there songs that are associated with it? If it's an oral society, are there stories? Is there a space? Is there a tree? Is there a location that would make this make sense? So it's voice, but it's all done within a 360 kind of idea. So the idea here is it's preserving memory, but it's not just to think about culture as culture under glass, because we're always looking at something as a reflection. You know, how does that tell you about something in history, politics, economics, art, aesthetics, life stage? How is it that something came to be? We have an exhibit up right now called Nation to Nation, which is about treaty relationships in the United States. And this is a group of people, elders and leaders from, again, Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, and they're looking at the Treaty of Canandaigua that was signed in 1794. And on it has a seal from George Washington and also their chiefs, and it's still an active living document. But this was the thing. So they came there. It's from 1794. It sits in the National Archives. It has all the wax seals, really interesting kinds of signatures in it. But it still affects their lives. And anybody who's a United States citizen is also a signatory to this treaty, which people don't think about. A treaty is from one to the other, right? It's a relationship. So to think about this historic object, this thing in space that you can look at, that's preserved and protected, but still impacts us. So those are the kinds of things to think about. It's not just what is it in its own time, but how does it travel through time, and how do we travel through time? So I wanted to give you all an opportunity to think about curating living voice. And I know there was an email set out about bringing an object or something that would be important to you. I'm just wondering, this is okay if you don't have it. How many people actually have them? Okay. Thank you. What I thought would be good, though, is if you don't have it, just take a moment to think about an object, a thing. It can be super duper humble. I travel with a few little things myself that are always stuck in my bag. I have a little piece of Palo Santo from Colombia to think about my children. I have a wild turkey feather to think about where I am and where I live now. And my latest spirit guide has been Harriet Tubman. I just feel like she's she's been with me, especially with all of the detentions that are going on. One of the detention centers that I was at recently is on the Eastern Shore, and I went across a place that was Harriet Tubman Parkway, and I thought, please help me. And so she's with me. So these are just little things I have in my bag. So you could either think about an object, even if you want to just take out a piece of paper and sketch it or say what it is, and take about 5 minutes to reflect on a personal object, personal treasured objects that speaks about you as who you are, and think especially about the ways that this object shapes you as an educator. You know? And again, it could be really humble. It doesn't have to be the mixed tech field. So take about 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll stay in tables and in the group, and I'll talk to you about curating those objects.